Angzo Digi Tuviata Dunga Celia, Anzu Dunga Yoyan Diang, Sem Madu, Yomon Beshawan Sonche, and Teletina Dunga Mobo Rashinical Dunga Yungores. Zanda Anzuki Dunga di Meva Sevala, Anzuki, Sem Yomon Batiki Meva Sokores. The di Meva Sebatella, and Yomon Batiki Yonsa, that's all kind of Shunguresine, Zawa Yonsadi. And the Chingazuke doesn't Marik Pass, Tinsin Marik Pass, De Deke, and Delatine, and the Dusha, Control, Aggregates, and New Mobatis Yungures. Tis not the needs, Tangazuke, someone on the European Yomobericti Meva Sokores. That dim Meva Sobala, Zawan Meva Sobala, that New Mobatazan, Marik Passadi Meva Sokores. The Meva Sobala and a Karim Meva Sokores in it, Tomba Yutubu, Locomche, Meva Senimatotion, Meva Setuya Omares. Tenza Tomba Yutu Lodo Combo Essage, Mother, and the sword which Casan decor my Chikshirua.
Good morning. So all of us sitting here want to be free of all pain and misery and experience lasting, stable happiness. In the vast majority, so much of the suffering that we experience comes about due to our way of thinking, our mistaken ways of thinking. In particular, our afflictions are what cause us pain. Therefore, to eliminate suffering, to attain freedom from suffering, it's these afflictions that we need to eliminate. With them eliminated, one attains lasting, stable happiness. And the wide variety of afflictions, minds such as anger, attachment, pride, jealousy, these all come from one root cause, namely the ignorance of self-grasping. So if we eradicate the ignorance of self-grasping, the root cause, all the other afflictions that follow from this, they too will cease. And last night then, we looked at this, as well as then, in brief, how to eradicate the ignorance of self-grasping. Because there is an antidote. The direct antidote is the wisdom that realizes emptiness. The direct antidote to an ignorance is a wisdom. And this particular ignorance of self-grasping has as its antidote the wisdom realizing emptiness. And it's this and this alone which is the direct antidote that can eradicate the root cause of all suffering.
Tombani to Kugor, the Ranzuki Tombani Toyo Marwa, Cesar Tombani to Kugor, Echere. The Tombani Tobala, and the Canis Togorelene, they are Jumten Yanda by some Tachi, and Jumten Yanda by some Tachi, and Jebachian, Tombani to Kugor, Hasan the Decor, she said, Cesar Jumten Yanda by some Tachi, Jumten de la Yanda by the Yanda, Jumten Norgio Mbuore, Cesar Dineza, Jumten Yanda by Jebachi, some Tachi, and Telatine, and Tombani to Doyo, the answer to Tombani to Lutiki, and on Dusina, Casan Decor, Shirua.
Also look then at how one goes about cultivating the wisdom realizing emptiness, because this is not the only way one can give rise to a wisdom is to cultivate it, and the way to cultivate it is to use reasoning. The wisdom realizing emptiness is something that we can cultivate. We have that capacity, but we have to rely on correct reasoning to do so. In order to generate this wisdom in our continuum, we've been looking at, in particular last night and preceding weeks, that one has to rely on reasoning, and in particular, correct reasoning, unmistaken reasons, in order to generate the wisdom realizing emptiness.
당은 동반이 당보 또에 김제 양다발에 잘리고레스 제상 김제 양다바 삼 마다바이나 안에 제바 마제바는 동바이 또 두고 말해 김제 양다바 삼다지 마노와지 삼다지 제바제는 동바이 또 두고레스 그러와 당보 또에 또 고레스 가산디슈 제산다 데니장 세데 동이 또에 대하러와 데니장 탈랑기 뇨 세마딜라 뚜괴베 리반남 탈투나 아니가서 뚜괴베세 디죠 Dini yang tar rangi nyoma tsema de la tu goibes. Jina dine ge jeba che du jeba che du dongba yin se de rangi tseme do go rese or rangi dini ya se dongba ni se ro tar tu na ya ba jeba che tar tu na na ga se rangi nyoma dongba rangi chong nyoma tseme chi tseme de ge go re se ji dongba yi do bei tsema de ge go re ma do dongba yi do ma tu ba na tsema de ma ge ba yin na dongba ni go me cha ma ro ji tsema de la tu goibes tsema ge go re se or.
Returning then to the text, so at the bottom of page 4, whether in the booklets or on the handouts, because they're the same from here, we come to the second sentence under the outline, the necessity of reasoning. Fundamentally, therefore, this process traces back solely to reasoning, which itself must necessarily originate from valid experiences common to ourselves and others. Fundamentally, therefore, this process traces back solely to reasoning. What is being referred to here is in order to realize emptiness, one has to rely on reasoning, and in particular correct reasoning, as was mentioned in the previous sentence. So here, the topic again, or the object to be realized is that of emptiness. And it only comes about, or solely comes about, in dependence on correct reasoning. And the sentence continues, which itself must necessarily originate from valid experiences. Valid experiences here we can understand as being a valid cognizers. To realize emptiness, it's essential that the quality of the realizing consciousness is a valid cognizer. So again, there are different consciousnesses and quality of consciousnesses. So a valid cognition is the quality of consciousness that one must generate, and the way to generate a valid cognizer is independence on correct reasoning.
tutu digi pingu duye mindu jeba cheche ane chik tseme ngeba magena oda jeba cheche odigi pingu orasin begi chwe jeba na ane dada chagyo marwa ane jiksine pingire jikine neba yonsigirwa chisa gari digi pingu duye mindu jeba che kansam chile ngone digi pingu yobade tseme ngeba nye son tseme ngeba nye ukurwa tseme ngeba nye ne an jinga zu beshi tamba na de pen mado nyoya de yungo marwa chisa tseme ngeba nye ukurwa di nanshin nga zu tongpa nye sede gymsen samda jeba cheche dan tseme ngeba manye bache da di insere sambe samda je dine chile chaja shabai na di dada chekma di nojo re jesa dine jeba chene di dada yinba de tseme dogo gore tseme ngeba ni muini su da hago gore jesa hago na dine gomba na gom yago chagre jesa tseme ngeba nye gore sa gymsen di she gorwa.
While some of the terminology may be alien to some students, the way of this approach, though, is very common in our daily life. For example, we all want to be healthy. So to be healthy, we know we need to accumulate specific causes. For example, have a nutritious diet, exercise, and perhaps we may need some specific medical treatment. So when we're deciding how to live our life so as to be healthy, ideally, we should make our decisions based on valid cognizers that have been generated in dependence on correct reasoning. What that means is we must have certainty in terms of being unshakable in our knowledge that this is the correct approach to take, not merely guessing. Not placing our decisions based on rumors that we have heard, but rather having certainty. And that certainty has come about in dependence on reasoning, and that reasoning has come about in dependence on knowledge. So through gathering knowledge, analyzing, investigating, one gains certainty. And this consciousness that has certainty, we can say it would be a valid cognizer, unmistaken cognizer, or an incontrovertible cognizer rather. So this is how we should, or we try to approach take the approach to our life, not to go on rumors or what people say, or just guess, but to come to a firm decision that has come about in dependence on reasoning based on knowledge.
Na denige da tongpa ni de rikpe cheba rikpa tseme to gore so da rikpa nam tarutu na se rikpa nam tarutu na ngosum ni la tupa ni is 지사 다 동방이 또 비게 리바 데라야 안에 지 당보 제바 끼고 그랬더니 안에 디젤에 지시 또 받쳐고 그래. 지사 동방이 또 리바 데라 안에 동방이 또 비게 또 받쳐마다 안에 무슨 채만 이용 거와. 지사 디네게 나네자 다 동방이 또 받습니다. 가 동방이 또 선선데 디니 지금 무슨 뭐 규리야 마공바 샤바네 디기리베선 디야 지투야 말. 가서 동방이 또 비게 또 받디게 동방이 두고 올 때 이내야 Delia and the Tunayore, Tugo, Tuare, Jazan, young body, Bemas Buddha Chago Mares. It's not D and did some Yasha, Jatanga Tomba Tos on some jet, and Dagaraja Dini, Monsignor Guelia, Tashimata Bane, Yaketo to Mare. Jazan Dini is that party, high part, Tomba Tope, Tosse, Topa di Gipa, Gomje, and Rangi, Gulia, Tomba, Mosum to be Lodi, Tomba, Mosum to be Luing or Juala. Gyurtuba Jegores, Gyurtugores, Jisan di Gyurtubne dene tomba yonson to beloti, that tomba to belonaneda, Jige, Chua Meba, Yahore, Jisan di Gombala dene, Mazuge, and Jiba Chasan Bantu Goreche, Jisan, Dian, Tar, but Monsum Yongola, Monsum the two. Duna and Monsum Nila Tuba is Monsum Goreche.
The text then continues. Thus it is the thoughts of Dignaga and Dhammakati, the kings of reasoning, that reasoning essentially derives from an obvious experience. So this then continues this line of thought that has been presented repeatedly or continuously thus far in the text, that one needs to come to in order to eradicate our faulty ways, our mistaken ways, our wrong ways of thinking, these afflicted minds, one needs wisdom. For wisdom to arise, it needs to be intentionally generated. To generate wisdom, we need to use reasoning. To use reasoning, we need to gather knowledge. So through gathering knowledge and reflecting, investigating, analyzing, we will give rise to wisdom. But we shouldn't, when we do attain some understanding of reality, we shouldn't leave it at that. We need to go deeper. When we gain a realization so that our way of thinking and interacting is transformed, we shouldn't be satisfied merely with that. We need to take the integration ever deeper. This then is similar to what we've been hearing previously, that when one comes to realize emptiness initially, it will be through a conceptual consciousness. And this then needs to be developed into a valid cognizer. And the first type of valid cognizer will also be conceptual, and this is an inferential valid cognizer. An inferential valid cognizer comes about in dependence on inference, in other words, reasoning. So it has come about in dependence on correct reasoning, as we've been hearing thus far. However, we shouldn't leave it at this point. This is still a conceptual consciousness, which means it has an error. It still has an error. It is not yet unmistaken or faultless. Therefore, we have to develop it further into a direct experience, or as we have here, an obvious experience. An obvious or a manifest or a direct experience. So this, what is so crucial, what the key difference between a direct realization or an obvious experience is that consciousness is unmistaken, is faultless. It does, whereas the conceptual realization, the inferential valid cognizer, this still has an error to it. It still has a mistake. So therefore, the key point that is being made here, as has been made before, is that we need to gather knowledge, investigate, analyze, and as we develop in our spiritual development, to not be satisfied with our development, to certainly take motivation from this, but continue our spiritual development. Because it's only when one gains direct experience that we have that our consciousness is of sufficient strength to eliminate the afflictions and their seeds, and eventually even the stains of the seeds. So here we need, the key message is firstly, analysis based on knowledge, and secondly, continuously develop this, not being satisfied with not relaxing or resting on our laurels as we progress, but continually improve the quality of our realizing consciousness. What is being presented here is in accordance with this scriptural teaching, or with the commentaries from great masters in India, such as Dignaga and Dharmakirti, referred to as the kings of reasoning. And the reason for these two great masters being called the kings of reasoning is that they established or maybe propagated the tradition of, or the process of using valid cognition, of using analysis and reasoning, so as to give rise to a powerful valid cognition. So this process was around before. They formulated it in the remarkable texts that they composed.
그래서 나는 저기 내기 다 동반이 또바디 또바선에 탈토나 무슨로 투바리 세디 동반이 검지 동반이 또 별로데 동이 무슨 뭐 교하시고 그래 텔라 투고 교고 그래 세지 순거로 와 무슨 탈토가 다디야 강을야 집에네 동반이 또야라 당부 무슨 고그래 해지 그래 무슨 고그래 배나가 저기 강사세디 강사세 당부 하고 해라 당보가 저 미게 가라 통과서 다시 풍부하게 통고를 다시 풍부 통이에 아니 풍부 통 되네 강사 뭐였어 되네 될라 되네 디때도 가지고 배나서 풍부에 때도 동반이 검지 동반이 또바이나 당보 또야라 당보 풍부 통고를 통보는 마통 와라 하 먹어라 풍부에 된 동반이 검에 하여 말아 제가 풍부 통야 수기 풍부 통야디 원심체 원시 체마에 통고를 제가 당보 수기 풍부 또 비교 원심체 원시 체마 제고를 대개는 수기 풍부 또 한 수기 풍부 때도 동반이 검 당보 수기 뭐 동반이 검에 이걸로 제일 당보 원심 고고도 원심 지고를 해제 되네 수기도 동반이 검 되네 동반이 또 로제산에 대한 바고 검진 탈도네 동용 원심 별로 뭐 주스 제가 원심 두고를 쓰되 당보 또야 대한 동반이 또야라 당보 다시 또 비 원심 체마고 그래서 원심 체마고 그래 안 디제도 동반이 또 되네 동반이 또 별로야 원심 뭐 주고래서 탈토는 원심 주고서 탈데래 토메 타다 제메 타 이용 거를 봐 당보다 이 타마세 이용으로 제가 니가 원심 두고 그래지 보세요 나도 수배 때도 동반이 권발라 당보 숙도 하 통고로 와 숙디 믹좀 되는 숙 통하여 말아 제가 숙 통하여 당보 미기 셰베 통고래 니 원심 체 말해 제가 당보 동반이 권이야라 동반이 검세시 다시디야 원심이 체메 도고래스 제가 당보 원심 체마 기고래 제래 다 토메 타들이 타디 제가 원심 체마 마게나 메나 수기 풍보도 원심 체마 마게나 수기 풍보 도고 말 수기 보마도는 수기 되는 동반이 검투야요 말 동반이 마검나 동반이 돌로 제요 말 봐. 제가 수기 풍보 되는 동반이 검말라 당보 수기 풍보 동비기 원심이 체마 기고 그래서 제가 수기 풍보 도비 원심 체마 제 산에 당보 원심 체마 제 되네 디데도 안 수기 풍보 때도 때가서 동반이 검 되는 동반이 도비 체마 제 제일 기우다 무슨 제일 기우다 제가 된 책기는 된 동반도 별로도 곰곰진데 타말에 무슨 뭐 유래스 제가 타르투나스데 타델이야 토메타다 치메타 토메타선 당보선 직년 자탐발라는 당보의 직책으로 타마의 자탐의 책으로 제가 토마 제가 당보 동반이 고메야라 당보 고주야라 무슨 지기고 그래서 무슨 체마지고 그래서 내가 때는 동반이 고 전 동방이 또 별로 끼었잖아요. 동방이 또 별로지. 아니 생원숨이 참여지 뭐 요구래. 세야지. 제가 원숨 탈투는 원숨의 된 세야지. 원숨 될래야 통마이 원숨 지나 타명 원숨 니가 연구래.
So what should be clear, because it's been mentioned many times, is that we striving to eventually give rise to a direct perception or a direct valid cognizer, understanding the ultimate truth, understanding emptiness or realizing emptiness. So this is the goal that we would strive for. And even when one has achieved a direct realization, to develop this ever further, to make it ever more powerful. But so thus we can say is our destination is to give rise to direct perception of reality. But when we're starting out, we're actually going to start to overcome mistaken direct perceptions. Mistaken in the sense of that it relates to a mistaken understanding. In that, as ordinary beings who grasp at true existence, we perceive the world primarily through our various sense direct perceivers. For example, our body. We closely associate our sense of self with our body. We perceive this through our visual sense direct perception. Therefore, when we start in our reflections on reality, we look at, we take as an illustration our body. This body that we have initially perceived through our sense direct perceivers, we now analyze and investigate this. So we start first with sense direct perceivers, and eventually through the process of analysis and investigation, we come to realizations of emptiness and develop that too into direct perceivers. So at both ends, we could maybe say bookending our spiritual training, we have our direct perceivers at both ends. At the initial outset, we take the information that we gather through our sense direct perceivers and that we mix then with our conceptual consciousnesses, this mistaken reality that we accept and believe, we eliminate this, transform it through using analysis and reasoning, and eventually at the other end, we give rise to direct valid cognitions or direct perceivers that are now in accordance with reality. So therefore, we can say that this entire progress or a procession has at the beginning end direct perception as well as at the final end. But the beginning end, these relate to more our sense direct perceivers in terms of how we, for example, perceive our body, and that there is later through the conceptual process error introduced. We eliminate this through the conceptual process using reasoning and eventually give rise through that reasoning to direct valid cognition that is in accordance with reality.
제상 안쪽에 치 숙소 유고 당 안쪽에 내수 신야 직다 망고 신야의 당보 호론의 가르고 성원숨 체마될 리고래 당 안쪽 당보 미기 통하게 잘라다 망보 통하게 당보 디수 미기 통하게 잘라지 숙들게 체매 또 사지 되는 제일이야 수티게 아니 디네 숙 첨보래샤 충충래샤 디 이게 규와 되는 된 주부세제 내수 신고에 차상 당보 왕시게 미기 셰바지 숙디 마통 숙 bensuti matong ba na mato ba na di an yuo zhuo ta de xin liu ma wa zhi dang bo su ti ne na nga zhe ge ji ge men jue jie da de cong jia ta de ka ren de lia ka che bei ne xin ye de dang bo wang xie che ma ji le du go wa be ne mi ge tong ne dang bo mi ge su de tong ne an di jie le ya an do che ma mo bo li go le di na xin a zhe dang bo lo zhong ka che bei ne ji ya ji am chu go go ji mi ge ma am chu go go ji 바 암초고 단님배 체마 왕시 체마게 안 될라 때는 안 지금 맞아 내서 먹고 거야 체 하고야 돼 똑바 체마 먹고 기도 거로 니나시 나저 로로 버지나 나모레 규모레 캐디리에서 차상지 만주 당보 지시 용하기 지시비 왕시기 용제 되는 용 하고도 안 딜량 아모레 규모레 지시는 대지마 다마라 먹고 체는 안 지게 내서 먹고 쉬우신 거로 봐 니나신 딜리네 디디야고서 다본 니 셰바시게 and delatine and the jiggy damara and the guato that did the Chazanis Mangoshin Gore. The Zanda Rajarus in Dambo Lule Rapi Rajarki, Raja to be one Luis Samaki, delatine original Raja Dinico DJ, then you are in a Raja Diba Diungres, yes, Mangoshin Goro. Just not top what Samaki, yes, she had Chazan, Dambon, to the Caracos, one she Samaki Gor, did one she Saman was some Samara. Just not one some Samaki or one she Saman was some Samaki, and delatine top what Samada, Madini, Payargetang, and didn't meet about to be Samasa, Dame about to be Samad, Tomboy to be Samad, Dindusli, and dear Pa Gom the yard of the Pabio Gaza told you, wants me Saman or you didn't. Then Gom yard, San Diego told you, didn't share a chasm, once more, Tartuna said, Sheba chasm, the once more you do. Matuba said, Jimmy Chasam, Tamachu, Zanga, Tartuna said, Mazuki, Tommy Tada, Tameta, even a Tameta, San Yukuma. San Yukuma told you, check Ganeshin to be Kilo Chasa, once more you do. Chesa, Dambo, Arzugula, dear, Dambo, Mosum Chiki. Della Tenandu, which in Topa Samajedu, Yagum, 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 Tameta, San Yukuma, that Chasam was more you do. Chesa, Tartuna said, Tommy Tada. Tameta Nigal sometime wants me to or essence.
To present this point again, to try to make sure it's clearly understood, the way that we interact with our world or experience our world is initially primarily through our sense direct perceivers. We relate to the world or experience the world primarily through what we see, hear, taste, touch, or smell. And those initial interactions are direct perceivers. So for example, and thereafter, or the sequence then continues from the initial interaction being direct perception. This follows then by conceptual consciousnesses, the wide variety of conceptual consciousnesses. So for example, if you garden, and you've planted something, and then a little while later, you see it growing. So now you've seen it. You've seen the little plant there, and so and this then is a visual, direct perceiver. Thereafter, you think, oh, it's growing, so there's some happiness. These are now your conceptual thoughts about what you've just seen. Then later, the plant has grown, and it's now full size, and you can say, it is now large, before it was small. To be, as mentioned last night, able to recognize that something is large comes about independence on it before being small. And the only reason here we can say this particular plant is now large is because we have now seen it as large. So we have a visual direct perception of it in its fully grown state, whereas there too we had a direct a visual direct perception of it being newly growing. So here, independence on these two visual sense direct perceivers, we can say it was small and it's now large. And that is conceptual, that is not a direct perceiver. But the point is, first, or initially, we interact with the world through primarily direct perception, sense direct perceivers. Thereafter, our conceptual thoughts flourish. So the illustration there was to do with something that we've seen, but this applies to all our sense perceivers. For example, you are all now hearing sound. The sound that you are hearing, that mere sound you are hearing through your ear sense perceivers. So this arisal of sound is direct perception. The hearing of sound is initially direct perception. Thereafter, conceptual consciousness are at play, imputing meaning and words to the sound that is being heard. And thereafter, further direct perception, further conceptual thoughts, thinking about the meaning, analyzing the meaning. Does this make sense? Doesn't it make sense? Does it not make sense? So initially, the way we engage with the world is primarily through sense direct perception. And the same then with touch. When we first aware of a touch of say a fabric, whether it's coarse or how this fabric feels, and then we can through our conceptual thought we can interpret it and experience it in that way, in a deeper way perhaps. So the first part of what I'm presenting here is that initially we engage with the world primarily through our sense direct perceivers. Thereafter, immediately thereafter, follow all our conceptual thoughts about what we have now directly perceived. Similarly, with our spiritual progression, we're looking now to come to the goal of developing direct perception in relation to our realization. But before we can come now to the other bookend of direct perception, we need to gather information, analyze and investigate that with conceptual thought, giving rise to inferential realizations, which are still conceptual thoughts based on correct reasoning, develop them ever further into direct perception. And even when we have direct perception of the object that we're meditating on, this we still need to develop ever further. So it's when we have, in our context of the topic here, a direct perception in relation to emptiness, that we then can start to eradicate the afflictions together with their seeds, and through continuing to develop this direct valid cognizer, this direct perception, we will be able to eradicate the afflictions together with their seeds and attain liberation. And developing this ever further, we'll eradicate even the stains of the afflictions, and thereby eventually attain Buddhahood itself. And when one attains Buddhahood, all one's consciousnesses are direct perceivers. So in this way, we can see that in our initial state as an ordinary being, we initially engage with the world through direct perception, immediately followed by conceptual thought. To spiritually develop, we use the process of conceptual thought primarily to develop into eventually direct perception. And that direct perception we develop in strength until we become a Buddha, and then all our consciousnesses are consciousnesses of direct perception.
That don't buy you dog, said that don't so the don't buy you dog, you load you combat tene, and don't buy you to load you awesome young worker. They are Yane to combat tene, and it was a new moba, doesn't matter by the bang, who is Tapa the Tamchi Bako Toyati, Tablando, Dinesh said that's all thing as we did Sungorua. So don't buy you to be done, but don't buy you dog, who is, this is don't buy you to Lodia, Yane Yado, Gomchi, awesome young worker. Dene wants me what Yane Yado Gombala Dene, and it doesn't matter but the Banku Gurias, the Bambala Dene, and Tabigo on top 2 Guria, Duma said 2 Gurias, and Digi 2 Guria, said the Tablam. So that don't buy you to double Loti Gom Guria, said to Sungur.
We've heard then that it's ignorance in particular that keeps us bound in suffering. And to eliminate this, we need to intentionally cultivate wisdom, in particular the wisdom realizing emptiness. And as one gathers knowledge and reflects and investigates, analyzes based on correct reasoning, one will eventually come to a realization of emptiness. This initial realization will be a conceptual consciousness. We develop this further until it becomes an inferential valid cognition, which is still a conceptual consciousness. This then is developed further into a direct valid cognition, and this direct valid cognition, which is a direct perceiver, is now able to start eradicating the ignorance of self-grasping together with its seeds. We continue this process of now, even though we have given rise to a direct realization of emptiness, we develop the power of this consciousness ever further until we eradicate the ignorance of self-grasping together with its seeds completely and thereby attain liberation. Thereafter, we continue to develop the strength of this direct perceiver so as to eradicate even the stains of the ignorance of self-grasping and thereby eventually attain Buddhahood, attain enlightenment.
Zanda dini zanda tongpa ni to zanda dangbo zu khasa tongpa ni jina tongpa ni to la dangbo zu gasa ge gasa da phungbo ni na ne zo dangbo sam ta ne gasa ge den sam ta komba no tong ni to le la yo res Gansa tin samata je ne phungbe tin do samta ba tongba do de skale kha yo res course jidang tongba ni ling ni la chara kheba yo mar de ne gashi koron dashi ji yo ro tongba ni gomse shi di jin kheba ji ne le la yo res ro le la yo res do sung go wa.
Last night then, when we started to look at how to cultivate the understanding of reality, how to meditate on emptiness, I mentioned that it's easier to start with meditating on the person rather than the aggregates of the person. So there's two key points here, and that is that whatever object one meditates on in terms of cultivates wisdom of realizing emptiness in relation to whatever object, the wisdom that one cultivates doesn't differ. There is only one emptiness to be realized, whether one realizes the emptiness of the self or of the aggregates, the consciousness, the realization of emptiness doesn't differ, but where the emphasis though, or the point that is being made, though, is where the difference comes, is not in terms of the emptiness that is realized, but in terms of the object that is realized to be empty. And it's said it's easier to realize that the self is empty first than, say, the aggregates are empty. The realization of emptiness doesn't differ, but the basis upon which one engages in analysis, this differs, and it's said that the basis for analysis of the person is easier to initially realize.
타마데 디셔고 셈기 때도고 지산 셈유 때도고 랑게 셈용오 랑시 마주보 모쳐바지네 고미야디 다 타마데 디리고래.
The guidance then is that initially in the meditation one focuses on the object or the person, coming to realize that it is empty of inherent existence. So that's the starting point, the initial point. But the end point, or eventually, one needs to reflect on that the aggregates are empty of inherent existence, in particular, consciousness. Come to realize that consciousness is empty of any form of self-existence or true existence or any self-defining characteristic. So we initially start with the person, but eventually we come to consciousness.
dine tikto se rimbaru che dine ki inja dine zanda kashigi oda tongpa ni gomse dangbo suda dine gomme be digi mare de ko so semgi tendo gom gure ma semgi tendo ma gomba na shanda tendo gomna phando kang ye jik yung mare sen sunga yung si bare wa dine ke sam si bare wa to pa yung si bare wa chizan de yung si bare de chi semgi de ma gomba tongpa ni ma do ba che chi su so da an chi phungbe te do kyang kyang gom je sem gi te do tong ba ni ma to ba na ting ne thar ba da tham ji me ko ba to tu ma re ni ne da dang bo nga ji gi ne chi ke lob jong re me da khar ji ne lob chen de le la wa de ne jang ge ji ka le kha de ka le chi ke sa ba de cha ba na ma ji gi le la che go ji sa na zo ha go ye ge de le la wi rim ba kan ji 지 공고츠비게 제바체도 지사 담보 가사테도 kom 가사테 동바니 하고에도 되네 풍보테도 되네 소소기 셈기테도 콤바네 레라요 지사 되네 자다 타마들 랑게 셈용 오쳐바 제제 곰전도 지네 엔 공고리 사지 디샤고레.
It's important to be clear on the stages of progression, because when one hears that, well, ultimately or finally, in the end, one needs to realize the emptiness of consciousness, one may think, well, why bother with the preceding stages? I'm just going to meditate on the emptiness of the mind. And if one does so, that's fine to do from one perspective, but the problem is one will not attain the desired goal of liberation or enlightenment. One needs to train in the sequence presented. And this is because it's through starting to train on something that is easier to realize that one, as a practitioner, is developing skill in this process. And as one becomes more skillful, one can then move progressively to subtler objects. And independence then on one's prior training and the skill one has developed with objects that are easier to realize, one applies this technique that one now has some skill in to a subtler object, and again, in this way, develops one's skill, and thereby later progresses to an even subtler object and so forth. So if one progresses in this correct sequence, starting with the person, concluding with consciousness, then one will attain profound realization and freedom.
Denigi jeba chile, denigi taope, denigi jeba che, samla jeba che du kapla, dene delia, ane chik tumda mangbo shiu chaya de, di gen sam dene le yungo, gyumzen roshi, masani, diwan ligo da kaje.
And it's for this reason that there are these varying philosophical tenets within the Buddha Dharma, so that to enable the practitioner to develop their skill in coming to meditate and realize that the lack of true existence on coarser objects, on objects that are easier to realize, and slowly, sequentially progress to eventually come to realize subtler and the subtlest of objects.
Denigi tumta kebasa tumta delia nangbu tumta yore chirugi tumta yore niga ge pashe diwan jeba chidu digi sosuge samna tantangi tone dene tumta mira bara dene si pashe sara samsa tuwa chirubi tumta yore nangbu tumta yore chesa nangba nala tumta ta mara yore ba chi an chirubi nale hindu nala da dene ge jige tumta ta mara yore ba chesa dene ge tumta dige yonsa de so de denige taiyue namsha jeba cheche jeba di cheyo sosuge samlo nang la tang tang yu tone an jeba che tang tone mira tawa mira chasang de dumba mira ba char ma do jebe tone chasang samba sangbo che gugure ngazu digi gugure tunga goya yo mar sa de jibaro chagduwa.
And I'd imagine that this is the case in other religious traditions too, not just unique to the Buddhists. That when one initially encounters the philosophy of a particular religion, it will be presented in quite a straightforward way that is quite approachable and relatively easy to understand. And as one delves deeper into the religion, one sees that there are subtler views presented. So it's the same in our Buddhist tradition. So I assume this is the case with non-Buddhist religions, and it's certainly the case in the Buddhist tradition, that there are presentations which are easier to understand. And it's through training first in those that one will be able then to develop the skill of mind to be able to truly or to validly, correctly realize the subtler philosophical views.
지사 디네 자다 가상 안쪽이 가사 다음에 동반이고 또 가사게 때도 공부를 라여서 가상 베이직 슈사로와 지사다 당아도 가사게 때도 다음에 뭐 공부하들라 당보 가사대 하고 고래 당아서 가사는 뭐 숨고고래 나 세대 나도 뭐 숨고고래 나이 때도 소소라랑 가사 공부해도 소소라랑 다음에 공부도 소소라랑 때도 공부고래 나 세대도 공부고래 제고래 지사 당보 나 세대 뭐 숨고고래 지사다 nga 세대 제바제 nga 세대 간치도 스네 심주에 소소 nga 세대 심주 제디 갑라 내래 미tumba 망부 따 삼다나 토는데 미tumba 망부 실내용 거래 미tumba 망부 리고래 삼다나 따보 nga 세대 어디 소소래 삼다나 토네다 따와 가서 좀다 미tumba 레데 디원 리고래 nga 세 삼다도 nga디 파 제바 nga 간치도 스베 삼다나 nga도 뭐 손위 갑라 nga ngoy sunda mira bali gore da nga ngoy sunda mira le de tumda mira cha son da de adam nga se jibar wa kasa nga da se nga se.
Last night then I started to mention that initially that it said that it's easier to realize the emptiness in relation to the person, and then last night we started to talk about how to engage in this meditation. And I mentioned that the very first point is to get an idea or come to see for oneself how the person appears to consciousness. So here, in this context, we can say the person is synonymous with the I or with the self. So whichever term is used, understand in our context here, these are synonymous. So the starting point is to gain experience of how our sense of self appears to our consciousness. And here, the varying philosophical tenets will have different presentations on how the sense of I or the self appears to consciousness. It's given an illustration of how non-Buddhists present that the self exists, which you check for yourself whether it matches with your own experience, because this is very, very common, that this is how we all innately believe the self or the I or the person exists. We are all sitting here now. I am sitting here. Last night, I heard a presentation on the same topic. The self, the I that is sitting here, and last night, this self is the same. I heard this last night. I'm hearing it again now. And actually, for the years I've been coming here, I've heard this presentation many times. I heard it, I'm hearing it now. I heard it last night. I heard it many times when we were looking at praise for dependent arising. So we have this feeling that I am here now. I was also here last night, and I was here some years ago. And then we look back over our life, and if we're having visual imagery, we'll see how we have physically changed. We may also think of how our personality has changed and developed, how we were different as a younger person and how we were different as a child, and certainly how we are physically and mentally different as an infant. So we all recognize this within ourselves. And we also tend to have this feeling that there remains this self that has existed throughout these lives, and that self hasn't changed. We'll recognize that certainly from when we were infants to right now, our body is very different. Our mind, we'd say, is different. Our minds are different. And when we look at the varying stages of our life, we'll say, yes, there was a sequence of my body changing. And we know from the approach, from the presentation of science, that our body right now is not the same as last night. Similarly, too, we'll recognize that our mind has changed and continues to do so. But our sense of self, this will say, no, that child in the photograph, that was me. The I has stayed the same. Then when we take into account past lives, we'll talk about the self of our past life, but being the same continuum as into this life. And when we project forward to our future life, we're striving to have a good rebirth for the same self that sits here now, that is accumulating virtue and dedicating to good rebirth, that being that will experience the rebirth, that self, that I, that person, the same as now. And I have a yearning to become completely liberated from suffering, maybe even become a Buddha for the sake of others. Who is that I? The same I as now. So this is how we relate to ourself, as there being something unchanging. The non-Buddhist religions make the assertion that the mind does change, it's impermanent. And the meaning of impermanent is changes momentarily. So the mind changes momentarily, the body too is impermanent, so the body too changes momentarily. But the self, the person, this is permanent. And the meaning of permanent in our context is, in the Buddhist context, permanent means unchanging. So the self is seen to be unchanging. But the physical and mental aggregates, the body and mind, these do change momentarily. So this is the tenet or the philosophical presentation that perhaps is presented by most or all non-Buddhists. So now we need to check for ourselves that is this also not the view that we have, the innate view or the naturally arising view that we have of ourselves, that our self, our I, our person, is permanent, is unchanging.
지상 강원도 지르바 대수기 가르송고라서네 지상 동아녀야데 다세 딱반자고 동아녀야 말해서 그래. 진짜 동아 수용으로 셈 용고래 셈이 동아 용고래서 동아녀야다 동아 대화녀야다 동아녀야데 셈 용고래서 근데 지금마다 다 그런 동아녀야 말 대화녀야 말고 유아줘야 딱바래서 대화 동아 가야녀야 말 진짜 셈기 대화녀야다 동아녀야 차상 셈이 용고래서 제가 또 셈다 셈다 아니 수우디게 메다바레 다 딱바래 해서 그런 쪽도 수시네 킬링거와.
The non-Buddhist tenets present then that the body and the minds, they are impermanent, so they change momentarily, but the self is permanent. It does not change. And they also then assert that the self does not experience suffering. The mind experiences suffering. The impermanent mind experiences suffering, but not the self. So this is the view of non-Buddhists.
당 저기 낭발라 지당에도다 제라마와던 되려봐서다 셈잠바다 우마랑주바다 안지게 우마 텐주바세 좀더 중국으로 봐 제산디 다위게 톤에 리고래 다 대양 간스 리고르선 당보들라 제산 다 세제주단 거로 봐 제산 제라마와던 제수게 다 세데 가르소도 제 심주지 풍보데 다래 샤서 풍보데 다 제라마와나 제산 망보에 가시게 풍보가가 다래서 가시게 풍보 찌라지 다래서 수유 풍보 다래서 되네게 제산도 제 저기 풍보 수유 풍보 다래서 다래 라용도 고노즈 가르케림 바자 아니 다래서디 수유 풍보데 다래서 제산 다디다 타르토노 수유 풍보데서 되네 켈림베게 다 켈링여도 다 다와지 잘모로와 안디나데 샘잠백에 시도 다 수기 공부 그런 다 말해 진짜 다 세대 가르쳐고서 그배 직 때문에 수기 공부해야지 그래서는 공부 세디 수기 공부도 지기 전에 안개와 수기 공부도 개와 치말 줘요 말아왔어 개왕하면 수기 공부도 다들 이거 말아왔어 진짜 다 세대 개왕하면에 되네 치말 주고 그랬어 진짜 다 세 수기 공부하잖아 지금 말해 다 가르쳐고 그랬으면 될야 안 때문에 샘 때문에 군시기 남바셔 봐서 샘 세디샤 다샤 디테도다 다음에 봐도 로사지 고 동반이 도로 샤거로 와치다 다 세디 군시기 남시에 세디 당을 송고래 그러저기 제자데 디체도 샘잡이 주탈려서래 다 되네야 지금 다 지지기 다도 제대제 다 군시 남시 세대 지금 말해 제자 다 세디 이 남시 남바시버 죽마도 요말 결혼 군시 남시는 그직 태와셔야 되네요 말다 다도 제대 이기 남바시바디 이기 남바시바 참모데다 다래서 킬링 거래 제가 이기 남바시바 참모 다래서 킬링데 다디 제바지도 제바시 샤르도 다 랑기베 따와 차소래 제가 다 되는마 따오제 다 이기 남바시바디 코로 다래 레기오 말해 제가 이기 남바시도 제 이기 남바시바를 파 풍보를 파다 풍보서 뢰파 따바 좀 지르마도 그런 거 뭐네 줍되게 이기 남바시 다래 줍바지 요 말해 제가 뢰파 따바 좀 지르 세지 따와데 케어데 텐주베 따와데 텐주베게도 좀 달래 제가 다 뭐에 송다들 미터 카가 차자 남비 줍다들래야 제라 마와나 도데바 네셈삼바 우마라주바 우마바나레 우마라주바 우마 텐주바 세데 고차래 그래서는 다 뭐에 송다 카가 차야데 다 디디도 곰비게 따와 다메바 또비 따와디 잡아 차르 거로와 제가 디네 인자 곧 데니클리용으로 와데
What I've just presented then is the illustration of the self that non-Buddhists in general present. Within Buddhism, there are a variety of, there are four primary philosophical views. These have their own sub-views, or their own sub-schools, and some of those sub-schools have their own divisions as well, sub-schools. So therefore, just from that, we can understand that there is a variety of presentations with regard to the self within Buddhism. So within the various Buddhist tenets, those with the coarser presentation of the Vaibhashika and the Sautrantika, they have a variety of views within them. But it comes down to, they say, that the aggregates are the illustration of the self. So the variety of the views would be that some say it's a collection of the aggregates, some say it's a particular aggregate, etc. So there's quite some variety within there. But then when we go to subtler presentations, such as the Chittamatra school, they refute the presentations of the lower tenets by saying the illustration of the self cannot be the aggregates, because the aggregates change. Those of you who say that it's the body, how can this be the case? The body clearly changes from life to life. Similarly, they refute the view that it is, say, the collection of the aggregates. What the Chittamatran presentation is of the illustration of the self is a very stable consciousness, a consciousness that does not change. And this is called the basis of all. And this basis of all is what those who subscribe to the Chittamatran presentation will say, this is the illustration of the self. Of the two then Middle Way schools, the Madhyamaka schools, the coarser presentation comes from the Svatantika. They refute that there is any such consciousness called the basis of all, but they do say that the illustration of the self is the mental consciousness, not just any mental consciousness, but a particular subtle mental consciousness. This is what travels from lifetime to lifetime. This is the illustration of the self. Then the subtlest view, the division of the Madhyamaka into the Prasangika Madhyamaka, they refute that there is a subtle mental consciousness that is the illustration of the self. They rather say the self is merely imputed by mind onto the aggregates. The self is a mere imputation. It's only or just an imputation by mind onto the aggregates. There's nothing that truly exists at all. So here in brief, we can see the variety of illustrations of self that exist within the Buddha's tenets, as well as previously the illustration of the self as presented by non-Buddhists.
소수기 풍봉어 뭐 강로를 받다 비게 따빙하지레스 지상 아주 풍봉당 나세디 뭐 타대요 말해서 지당 민 타대요 되네 뭐라 타대 봐지요 말해서 뭐 찍버려서 아주 아주 어디 레다지
For people such as ourselves, practitioners such as ourselves, we will come to study and gain knowledge and understanding in relation to what is meant by the aggregates, the physical mental aggregates and the self. But really, we do not, when we relate to our sense of self, we don't differentiate between the self and the physical and mental aggregates. We see them as being of the same essence.
그래서 benengar juga lapa yeba de yembani di ko ngo tade le cha de ro 지상 juga lapa yeba de nana lapa yemba nagyo marwa 지상 nga lapa yeba nagyo lo yemba nagyo le marwa 지상 당 nga juga konyu bekkoran tade bar cha de nga ju 풍보 되다 nga 세지 ngo 지버레시 ngo 개발 요 말해지로 인자 당 안주 가서 오르스네 nga ju 풍보 나여도 오가 나기도 le 거래 지상 나 락바 예바도 연바 나싱할 풍보당 나니보데 타데바 심베이나 enge 풍보 나기도 마도 나 나기도 렉 말와 나 락바 예바 나기도 마도 연바 나기도 렉 민도와 지사 나 풍보 나기도 마도 나 나기 민도 렉이로와 디 렉 민도와 나저 렉요 말 지사 나 풍보 나기도 나 나기도 락바 나기도 나 나기도 렉거래 아니 제자 디네 상하주 풍보다 나 사니디 뭐 열매래서 뭐 찍바래 자고래 제가 디네 상아도 풍부 나여도 만나기도 생활 저기도 뭐 숨고로 와.
For example, we have our left arm and our right. We would all believe that these have ultimately or in the end the same essence. We don't differentiate between the left and right hands other than we call this one the left and this one the right, but we'd say they ultimately have the same essence. So similarly, with our physical mental aggregates and the self, we would say in the end, they are of the same essence. For example, when our body is in pain, we don't say my body is in pain, we say, I am in pain, I am feeling sick, I'm under the weather today. We don't say, oh, my body is in pain, I am sick, I am in pain. So this is how we experience the self and the aggregates as being of the same essence.
디네 자다 나 저기 도심데 나 저 미디 안에 코 통성 라비도 갈라고선 코 수부도 통에도 코 통성 라고 봐. 제가 나 저 수부들 파 따고래. 제가 디나신 아주 도심의 수부도 고기마다 도 되게 갑라 나 대예슬고라. 나도 수부도 고기하다 강반이도 도스지 파 고기었다 저도 안 공바자 저도 갑라 아니 나 두고예라고 봐. 제가 나도 수부도 가래 지기도 수부도 되되베네 나 돼. 수부도 파 두고는 나 두고예. 수부도 마 예대가 마 예대는 나 예예. 수부도 야 랑되면 나 랑예. 제가 나도 수부들 따지네. 수부도 야 거도 여면 나 랑예. 수부도 마 되되면 나 돼. 수부도 파 고기야 두고예면 나 두고예서도. 제가 디네상 하세야 딩아도 수부들 따지네. 두고예 말 칼라사게 직례가리 차산디 디 수부를 될 따는 하세디 따고 봐 저게.
This is the way that we relate to our physical mental aggregates as well as ourself as being of the same essence is very clear when we look at how we talk about ourselves, such as with illness, but also if someone says, what are you doing right now? I am sitting. And later, I am going for lunch. I came here this morning. Or if someone asks you, did you see a friend? You say, yes, I saw her. And in all of these instances that we say, I am here, is in relation to that our body is here. Or I am walking, our body is walking. Or I saw someone is independent on having seen her body. So this indicates how our body, or our aggregates, are an integral part with our sense of self. That for us, our sense of self and it is integrated, is not differentiated from our physical and mental aggregates.
대가서 초화될 다는 시고 지상 아세데 초화될 다고와 안저기 되네 자다 나세데 삼다나 증거 손달에 아주 두구에 되기에서도 풍부될 다 이시도와 다 등한도 초화 대화용도 나기부도 초화 동화용도 나 강아도 기부민도 세데 초화를 다 이시도와.
And so too with our mental aggregates. So for example, how are you? I am in a good mood. How are you? I'm not so happy today. So what we have here is we have a feeling of a pleasant feeling or a suffering feeling, and we relate to this as ourselves. So again, our emotional world and our sense of self are entwined. We do not differentiate between them. So therefore, the physical aggregate, our body, is integrated. We do not differentiate it with our sense of self. Because our body is sitting here, we say, I am sitting. Similarly, how are you feeling? And then we look at what feeling has arisen within us. I'm happy, I'm unhappy. Our whole emotional world is integral with our sense of self-identity. So again, body, mind, those two, the aggregates, as well as our sense of self, we do not differentiate between them. We see them as being of the same essence.
지나다 가브리엘 양은 두치네 아직에 초와 가면 기베데 두 스테이지 양은 삼로다시로 내가 디체네 가랑사 디니치네 약보 삼다야 저로 제바지 삼다네 지자 디니기 삼로 코 내가 제데 저 가르치게서 나 삼로 당규를 배우러 와다 지자 나 삼당규에서데 that sometimes number sheba number 제바지 파두스네 야고도 마 sometimes number sheba 도 뭔지 그 제가 디가서 number sheba들 파가서 다시고 다이고로 와 number sheba 나 삼당 게 삼는데 내 코송 내 되네 코도 세시야 지도 삼로데 number sheba 제바지 디지다 디 이제 야고디 야고 제바지 삼로데 number sheba 뭐 규로도 ngadi samtang ngadi sam ko to si de nga nge sam ko si nga se tilba number she ba da ni ji she yong lo.
Similarly, if you're with someone and they notice that they've maybe been speaking and you're a bit quiet and they say, what are you doing? And you reply, I'm thinking about what you said. So here we are thinking about what is being said. Similarly, you're hearing a teaching now. Everyone's sitting here in silence, but you're hearing something and reflecting on the meaning of what is being said. But we relate to this as in, not that consciousness is reflecting on what is being said, but I am reflecting on what's being said. I am thinking about what's being said. So again, we have this we do not differentiate at all between our sense of self and, in this case, our consciousness, or the mental aggregate of consciousness.
지상도 시간에 삼다에도 나 세야되다 나 세대 가는 시에 람나 풍봉하고 강르질라 다샤비 나치르 따바따빙 따바치마도 따비게 나치르 풍봉하라 따비기 자와치 현지라 나 세야고다 데니시마도 나 세야데 강사 세야데 풍봉하고 강르질라 따지 강르라데 까빌 수기 풍보 까빌 소유 풍보 데니기 강르질라 따비게 나 세야데라 다 강사 세야지 데니지가 두치 심지제도 지다 nga 세야데 풍봉아 봐 강르지라 따뱅아 지라 가사 세딩아 가사 세딩 뭐 소야디 데네치를 숨고할 당아주.
But if you investigate in fine detail, what is the self? We will come to recognize that the self is a concept that is merely imputed by mind onto the aggregates, onto the physical and mental aggregates. This is all. If we investigate in detail, we'll see that the self is merely imputed by mind onto the aggregates. And this is the meaning of the term person. Person is merely imputed by mind onto the aggregates.
지난 두 삼다에도 지상 강사 세디 지난 풍봉아보 강르실라 따제는 지 샤나마도 풍봉아보 강르실라 마템바체디네 로송하 세디 풍봉아보다 저와균이 메팅하 세디 샤야라기오 말 메레다 지난 디네 가지 이거 말 이해요 말다 이거 말 지상 두 지네 나 세디 간르실로 나 세디 풍봉아보 강르실라 파 뢰파 따비기 안지기 나지라 강사라고도 지상 풍봉아보 강로라 저와균이 메데겐 제메 된신 나 세디 민도하스 풍봉아보다 저와 풍봉아보 강나 마디버 저와균이 메데겐 나 세 로소 나지 니유데스 녜미도 메민도하스 지상 나 세디 간디 가사 세디 간디 주세네 자 간디 샤워서 풍봉아보 강로질 파르에 따비게 나 세디 데니질이야 나 저와지킨질라 다 나 세디 샤우도 세디 언두스네 나디 다 풍봉아보 강르치를 뛰어받마도 풍봉아보 강르를 마되비기 나지 민도세지.
In going through the investigation, where one comes to the conclusion that the self is merely imputed by mind onto the aggregates, one recognizes then that the self is not independent or unchanging. Because it is merely imputed onto the aggregates. There is no independent self that can be found, or unchanging self that can be found. Rather, it's just an imputation, the self is just an imputation by mind onto the aggregates.
다도 당아 세대가 로려야 간데 난기도 다디 심주 니베 차고다 지상가 로야 삼다도 로세대가 간데 난기도 삼다도 로를 파나에도 나디 풍봉아보 가르라 마도 가야 마도바 뢰파 샤바 마인바 코롱웨니 주바로시 nengo다 디 나수데 템바 주바 나수데.
The first step is to gather knowledge. As has been presented here, knowledge in terms of how it is said that the self appears and then how the self actually exists, as well as then how to come to an understanding of that, the analysis, how to engage in analysis. So that's the first step, this gathering of knowledge. Together with this then is the application of that knowledge. And there the first step is to come to see for ourselves how the self appears. So one gains knowledge, but one shouldn't just leave the knowledge as something intellectual, something that you know or you've read, but you need to see whether it's correct for oneself. So here we look at how the self appears, and what we'll come to recognize is the way the self naturally appears to us is as if it is unchanging or permanent and independent from anything at all. It's not influenced by anything at all, but rather independent. So having these two characteristics of being unchanging and independent is what we mean by it being permanent, but mean to be truly existent.
다위게 남샤 도비기 루르 지체 최발라 줌바당 상부괴 개발라 로드괴 세나스 데니게 아니 제 삼수 용시기레스 고.
What I've presented then thus far, I present to you now to engage in reflection on. This we'll come to a more detailed presentation of this later, But for now, use this knowledge that's been presented so as to try and gain more experience of how our sense of self naturally appears to us. Now returning then to the text, the bottom of page 4 is a question. For the sake of improving the mind, what is the point of using discriminating intelligence to develop valid cognizers and states of consciousness that realize presentations of views? What practitioners need is a virtuous character and to be kind-hearted. It is the scholars who need intelligence and reasoning.
Chitan semba ngambi rik de la tene ananga zulya dunga nyoya ta rashi nikala kanga de sem ngambi rik de le gores the sem sangbi rik de la tene ane shan lia phampa tu ba ta rang la ti ju sem sangbi rik de le gores kisin dang bong ga ti shu ro chitan dine za ta ngang zu sem di ngambi rik de pa me ba su sem sangbi rik de sing sangbo di yar dong sang du dang ko dong ko ya ga dang ko ye che ro di dang ko re se jo ya de ya sem sang du dong wa se de
This is a good question to look at, because this is the doubt that often does arise. Why do we need to engage in this cultivation or this accumulation of knowledge and all this type of analytical meditation? All we really need is to be nice people, good-hearted, kind people. So this is a doubt that is likely to arise. You'll recall that when the text started in our first classes, we looked at how consciousness can be generally divided into two. Those minds which can be called wholesome and those which can be called unwholesome. And that the way to differentiate between the two is wholesome minds bring benefit to oneself and others, and unwholesome minds bring harm to oneself and others. So the text began with that presentation and then continued from firstly how to differentiate between the two, and secondly the need to cultivate and strengthen wholesome minds in order to counteract and overcome and eventually eliminate unwholesome minds.
Zada sembe sangbo de yarke tangje sembe sangbo de gomje yarke tangje nga zu digi chupu gore tizan de duwa za deji koyala sembe sangbo de yarke tangwala deji nga zu nyel sheye ge tongba yin to be chema sa da tongba yin to bi lo lo je de ne ge jeba che ge namsha de ge goya mi duwa se gore chema da dai namsha to bi lo je ji chi es jeso goya mi do di ma go ma di jeso sam me ba ne nga zu sembe sangbo ta ne digi duwa se gore.
Looking at the first sentence in the question, for the sake of improving the mind, so improving the mind, turning the mind away from unwholesome ways of thinking and cultivating wholesome ways of thinking, strengthening our wholesome ways of thinking, what is the point of using discriminating intelligence to develop valid cognizers and states of consciousness that realize presentation of views? Sorry. So here, the person is asking the question, surely it's sufficient just to become kind-hearted, to strengthen the good qualities in my personality, and thereby to weaken the unwholesome states of my personality. What is the need to come to study and understand these philosophical presentation of views in order to realize emptiness? There's no need for all of this. Surely it's sufficient to become a good person in the way that has been presented, become a kind-hearted person through strengthening wholesome minds. Surely there's no need for all this difficulty involved with studying different views and reflecting on them.
Tawi namsha da denigi jaba chegi sherapki logic de goyas minus tina che yago cheba le zumba la ne tsurum yago sonya so lunga yisu nyeje timbe tsurum yago sonya da ane lunga yisu nyeje timbe tsurum yago sonba ne shala ne ba yung mare so so le tipa sag mare la 제자다 상보 고열래 semba 상보 샹래 잠바다 제와 공고래 샹나 잠바다 제와 semba 상보 요나 디게 샹래 판바 두투고래 제자 최야고 냠래 제발 줌보 추름 야보 송 잠 이제 셈바 상보 제나 지고레스 마도 다 셰르 제바제야다 따위나자 망보지 망그지 리바 망고 삼다데니기 어디를 미다바레 아니 지 동반이레 아니 지지레니에서 데데 따위남베 제바제야기 로제디기 리바디 요고 해요 말에 최념내 야고 제발라 지선 최야고 제발라 가서 줌보 추름 야보 송 셈바 상보제 고야디리에서 월다
The question then concludes with, what practitioners need is a virtuous character and to be kind-hearted. It is the scholars who need intelligence and reasoning. Person then here is asking a question, saying that all these views on tenets, they're difficult to understand, and quite frankly, I don't see the point. I want to be happier. I want to have a good influence on those around me. I want to have a beneficial influence on our world. To do that, why do I need to hear about all these philosophical views on how the self doesn't exist in order to be able to refute it, and then try to come to understand how the self does exist? What is the point of spending all this time and this energy to understand things which are difficult, and then to meditate on this? Surely, it's better to cultivate a solid foundation of ethical restraint, in other words, and thereby have a virtuous character, and to combine this with cultivating love and compassion, and thereby be kind-hearted. Surely that is sufficient to have a meaningful impact on the world, as well as to be happy within myself. Those who want to be scholars, they can then apply reasoning and gather knowledge. But for people like someone such as myself, it surely is sufficient just to have a virtuous character and to develop a virtuous character and develop a kind heart.
chi ne su go sheba na zamli go shina zamli ji de ku ju dum zamli juwa de to go sa da de su je ne su je xin go xie je xin go ro de ne ga ji ge lobchong ro lobchen de dang bo di jiang ni ba de je ya go yo la se ba xie da ren di na ji nang bei ta ru na oda sem za ba de je ra ma ta ra de chi ru be ta wa de se ta ru de yo sa pa ji 개바 제발라 이미디 개발해라 망부 신고고로와 제가 신고할라 데 셰럽다 제바지 셰럽 고고 신고고 진짜 개바 진짜 마신나 개바 자기 말해서 뭐 개바스도 가리네 셰여 가지고로와 진짜 되네기 개바 제발라 로드기 되네기 리바 삼다 로드고 리바 셰럽기 제바지 돼 냠네 고고레스 개바 제발 최야고 제발라 디고야스 요mer 주름이하고 숭 삼바 상고전에 디그리 했어야지 어두슨 거로
This is really a good question to look at, because it is, I think, often how people do relate to the Buddha Dharma. Looking at the world that we have grown up in, there are those who are scholars, the professors in university. They need to know their subject matter extremely well, because they are scholars. Whereas average people like ourselves, we benefit from their knowledge and what has come from that knowledge, what has been developed in dependence on that knowledge. But why do I need to know all of these things? Why do I need to be skilled in all these various areas? I can just live a good life, a wholesome life, by making use of what's around me. So similarly, in terms of the Buddha Dharma, yes, there are those who are scholars and who are learned, who are the professors of the religious world. They need to know things in great detail, so they need knowledge and apply reasoning to establish that knowledge. But for the rest of us, we can gain benefit from what they've achieved, but we need to focus just on cultivating a kind heart through cultivating love and compassion, and have a virtuous character through having a solid basis of ethics. Surely that is sufficient.
데네게 삼초 용식이래서 semba 상도 동안에 최바는 준바다 상보치 수름이하고 송 semba 상보치는 지기래서 근데 셰럽기 남샤데 막고 제바체를 거예요 말해서 개바 차발라 아니 지기 데네게 로드기 제바 막보치라 고그래서 어두스네 삼초지 용식이래서 데네 용고래서 용시바래서 산나스도 용식이래서
really what it comes down to is this person is saying the philosophy which is difficult to understand and difficult to contemplate, really there's surely is no need, unless you want to be a scholar, to get carried away with spending so much time and energy on that. It is certainly sufficient just to have a virtuous character and to be kind-hearted.
자, 데니 인자다 여름 제 가르 순고로선 데니게 삼주 용 시바리 지단 용바이나 디다다 책 말레스 가르스네 셈바 상도 동워 림바 망고 예스 아주 셈바 상보데 야 당게들레 당당게 림바 망고 요레스 그래.
As you can see from the length of the answer, His Holiness does not accept this doubt. And he spends some time now responding to this, because this is a valid question in the sense that it's a question that arises. He starts out by saying there are many stages in the improvement of the mind.
지산다 림바 망보요네 셈바 상보동다 림바 망보요레 스페네 가시스로 김찬라 제 미고바 이시기 대바 점 제주도 공부하다고 예매 요레스 베능한 주기 신의 주도 갑라 된거 김찬 셈바 삼단의 셈파치 쳐주고 봐 진짜 신의 주도 갈라 셈 제주도 유지라면 제주도 내제 공화주 띵이진데 야게 땅고 셈 띵이진이 봐 누가 쳐 땅고자 이제 디네자 다셈 넘버 마야 유라 제주도 내제 대제주 내제 안 누우시네 나도 띵이진데 야게 땅에도 갑라 디제바치고 말다 그 제주도 내제 대랑 두시네 그 두시네 야게 땅다 림바치 그래서 그러다 가시 빼디로 빼천도 쉬버나 디나시네 셈사도 림바 망보 유베나네 가시 김천라 미제 미고 김천 삼다 먹어야지 데레 이시게 대바 잠지게잖아 제주도 곰예 안셈베 셈시 누바야 쳇다 셈베 상다야라 데네게 자상지요 레소레 디베는 아주 신의 주야 지게서 그래 신의 주야.
His Holiness continues. There are some in which, starting at the beginning, there are many stages in the improvement of the mind. There are some in which analysis of reasons is unnecessary, such as when the mere faith of trust is to be cultivated single-pointedly. So to give an illustration then, when one is sitting in meditation with the objective to develop calm abiding, single-pointed concentration, to develop one's mental factor of stabilization to the point where one can hold the object, any object of meditation, single-pointedly for an indeterminate period of time, for an unlimited period of time, whilst one is sitting and meditating then, trying to develop calm abiding, at that time, one doesn't use analysis. One just brings one's mind to the object, and when it is distracted, brings the mind back to the object. So one is not engaging in analysis here, but is rather just bringing one's mind repeatedly back to the object and then trying to abide on it for ever longer periods. So this is an illustration where one is not using analysis.
bene dina shin 당한 저 bene dina 잠바 코메데 심전도 대화도 되나 sabbe 삼 제지도 검제 검야데 제바 가야마 심제 대화도 되나 sabbe 삼다지 양 잠발에 제지도 검야 제 연구로 받는데 연구래 검야 검잡사 내 심제도 동하다 되나 sabbe가 삼다 대하 대랑 삼 제지도 제제 한 제바마 삼마다제 잔다 삼 시메제데 되는 제지도 등에서 삼다제 검야 연구로 받아서 제바 마제바고 셈 제주도 내지 로저기 제바 마체바제는 도 검나디 띵에선 제주도 내 검나디 순고르와.
A further illustration would be having meditated on love. One comes to the point of generating the thought, may all sentient beings abide in lasting, stable happiness, and love arises within oneself. One's not analyzing at that time. One is abiding in this feeling of love that has been expressed through, may all sentient beings abide in happiness. Similarly, with compassion, having gone through the meditation and concluding with, may all sentient beings be free of suffering, Compassion arises with a strong wish, may all beings be freed of pain and misery. At this time, no analysis is undertaken. One is abiding in the thought, may all beings be freed of pain and misery, compassion. Or one is abiding in the thought, may all beings abide in happiness. And this then is love. So at these points, one is not engaging in analysis.
Dene gomna shungure ina de samji se nuba cher mi thwen las dene gomba samji nuba ya chenpo chatu ma de shere pene shine zejidu gomje shine zejidu gomje shine drupde shine bado druptu gures 지난 제주도 gomje 다하라 제바 마제바 ine shine di mado di gangal ya lakhrong se le tu druptu mares 지난다 delya yarge chimbala 다 제바체 shine 당보 제주도 내제 shine gom dene shine drup체we chela 데누 제바 마제바나다 시네랑 원이리마데 델레 야게 조투 마레스 제다 디 야게 조발라 아니 델레야 시네데 제슈데 네베 안에 아니 셰랍키 제바체 아니 사통 줍체 안두스 야게 담고 그래세 디나 니엘디 순산지기도
And the text continues. Not much strength, however, is achieved by that alone. So again, there is a place for meditation. There is a purpose to meditation that doesn't involve analysis, such as the point of the meditation or the part of the meditation in love and compassion, where one abides on the feeling of love and compassion, as well as when one is cultivating calm abiding. However, as the text says, there's not much strength is achieved by that alone. Let's say then one has achieved calm abiding, single-pointed calm abiding. One will not get anywhere further than that if one doesn't use analysis. The purpose of developing calm abiding from a Buddhist perspective is to develop it further so that one attains the union of calm abiding and meditative insight. But in order to give rise to meditative insight, one has to engage in analysis. Because without meditative insight, even though one has attained calm abiding, one will not be able to progress towards the attainment of our spiritual goals. So again, whilst calm abiding can be attained without analysis, to progress further and achieve the union of calm abiding and meditative insight, analysis is essential.
지난 다데네기 사바도 셈상보 타메도 조아니 검제된로 검지 지부 미쳐버 된데 김선다 덴바시 시고구리에제 된데라 지난 내가도 잠바 셈데 대바다 되나 셈베 삼로 디삼 검되나 야게 조투 말레스 셈제 동안에 자나 셈베 지지부 잠 검되게 야게 조투 말 지난 데네기 잠바다 제위에 삼로티 야게 공부해도 타메도 빠 누버 침버 차야라 가르고 그래서 검제 된라서 장주 잠바 검야다 니지 검예게 된텔이야 바 지부 공부 좀 미쳐봐 디 김선 삼당 거래 가서 잠바 공부비 김선 가래 검나 제부 판도 가래 용고래 아니 니지 공부비 김선 가로 검나 판도 가는 두 아니 공부비 제부 가래 용고도 마공반에 교연가도 교연나 판에 센데 되네 잠바 공부비 잠보 검나 될라야 아니 리바 제바 니지 검나다 그것은 샘제 탐제 대어 고비 김세 삼다 한 대어 좀 니비 김세 삼다 두선 제바 제제 잠바도 잠바 검 니지 검 될라야 제바 제 두신 검바이네 야 누가 검바도 좋고 그래서 지난 되네기 제바 맞제바 샘제 대화도 되나 샘베 삼 지부당 샘제 동안에 자나 샘베 삼 지부 당제베기 지삼로데 야기 뉴버치모 조투 말에 지산네 야기 뉴버치모 조알라 디 검제 대나 념도 아니 가브릴리아 제바지 검구비 김체 가네가네 검구구도 야기 땅상 가리스 땅구도 제바제 두 제바이나 고 야기 탐에도 배투야라 제바 고고리에서 그래.
The text continues. Let's read the two together. Not much strength, however, is achieved by just that alone. especially for developing the mind's limitless goodness, it is insufficient merely to familiarize the mind with the meaning of its object of meditation. So, whilst in the illustrations given, for the cultivation of calm abiding, as well as love, as well as compassion, there are parts of the meditation where analysis is not used, especially in calm abiding, but also with love and compassion. However, in order to get to that point in the meditation where one is just placing one's mind and not using analysis, prior to that part of the meditation, one would have used analysis. Moreover, when one has gained familiarity with the object of meditation, whether it's calm abiding one's cultivating or love or compassion, to develop it further, again, one needs to use reasoning. So for some meditations, there are parts of the meditation where one just abides on the object. But this is preceded and followed by reasoning. For example, when meditating on love or on compassion, one uses a variety of reasons to generate love within oneself. Then one abides on it. In this way, you strengthen your habituation to the consciousness of love which has arisen. Later, so as to develop love into bodhicitta, one again has to use reasoning. So therefore, to initially generate love, as well as then later to take the generation of love and develop it into bodhicitta, reasoning is required. The utilization of one's analysis and intellectual capacities using analysis and reasoning is essential. Because, as the text says, merely familiarizing oneself with the object of meditation will not lead to deep or lasting change. Reasoning for this reason is essential.
지게 녀모보 여 파체 자와디 다세 마릭바리 디바발라 동방이 또 고레스 지산데 동방이 또 발라 담봉을 지게 제바 삼다하네 나 세드 두 삼다하 대신 아주 제바 체타나지 나 세드 두 삼다제 나디가 네스두 생와디 뭐 소야게 삼다 제바 제다 두스체네 뭐 소야다 안디나시 데데데데러 셰바네 다른 저게 샘자 지게 지샤래 잠바다 제와 공고비 김체 공바이나 안에 라셴니가라 제보 간의 중국에 안 잠바단 제위기 도초 안 샤래 뇌베 삼바다 되니게 마고 공바이나 안에 라셴니가라 가리용 그에 되니게 심주 제바체 안 디나네 아 저게다 상비릭 삼바 상비릭디 아 저게 야게 다야 돌야 아니 도스체네 삼다디 디링기 아 저게 가사나 디링걸 다디 쇼게 글롭찬티 되네 차거와 어디네게 다들 요게데 되네 도스치는 가지고 다음 그 가사 아세가 세데 간질라우드가 세 가사 세데 가와도 되네게 간질 띵기도 풍보 나버질 간질 띵기도 민도 매팀바직 나세데 간질 용도 민도 도스치네 아주 심주 제바지야디 게체 뭐라 차거와 안디링이 아주 저게 글롭찬데 디체 다들 많이 원절을 못 주셔야지.
To conclude then, what we've looked at this morning is we're continuing with the initial presentation of the text, which is establishing the need for reasoning, and reasoning based on knowledge. In order to transform our minds, we need to have knowledge, and then that knowledge needs to be integrated. So we need to hear many teachings, and whilst hearing them, reflect on their meaning, and continue this process repeatedly of hearing and reflection and meditation. We start out, as we saw initially in the text, with understanding the primacy of our mind in terms of whether we experience happiness or pain or misery. Recognizing that our unwanted suffering comes about in dependence on our ways of thinking, the afflicted minds. So we spoke about earlier how it's the afflictions, minds such as ignorance, anger, attachments, pride, jealousy, that cause us pain, and when we express it, express these minds, we bring pain into the lives of others. How do we know this for ourselves? We gather knowledge, say, from teachings, and then we use our reasoning intelligence, which is what's being presented here. We use analysis to think about what is being said, and then to meditate on it, to come to see the validity of it. And in this way, we come to recognize that it's unwholesome ways of thinking, our afflictions, that cause all our pain and misery, and lead us to bringing suffering into the lives of others too. Moreover then, we continue this process of investigation and analysis based on knowledge to recognize that it's through cultivating wholesome minds that we will overcome the unwholesome minds. So cultivating virtuous minds. So these are the antidotes to our afflictions. And amongst the many antidotes to the afflictions, the supreme antidote is the wisdom realizing emptiness, because it's only the wisdom realizing emptiness, the wisdom that realizes how phenomena, the self and other phenomena exist in reality, that we can overcome the root cause of all suffering, the ignorance of self-grasping. So here, following the same process as when we're looking at wholesome and unwholesome minds, the same process of hearing, reflecting, and meditating. Hearing knowledge, gathering knowledge through reading and hearing, and then reflecting on it whilst we're hearing, and later at our homes, using analysis and reasoning. And the first point here was to gather knowledge, and whilst we gather knowledge, reflect on it. We looked at earlier in this session on how the self appears to us. So this is something we have, on one hand, great familiarity with, in that our sense of self is ever present. But on the other hand, we have no familiarity with it because we pay no attention to how our self appears to us, our sense of self. And in fact, it appears integrated or mixed, completely mixed with our body as well as our mind. So this is the first step in the meditation, is to come to get a feel for how the self appears. And we hear in the theory that it appears as if it's independent. The self is independent of the body and mind, in that it's not influenced by the body and mind. And it appears to be unchanging. We have the same sense of self from past life into this life, from young to now, as well as into tomorrow and the future and future lives. So we need to see how the self appears, and then investigate with reasoning, using our intelligence, to see whether it exists in the way that it appears or not. So that's then a summary of what we've looked at this morning, how it fits into the overall presentation of the text, and we'll continue then from the same place this afternoon. And if you have some questions, then please feel free to ask. Gyatso?
In your presentation of the art going from sensory direct perception to conceptual and inferential awareness to direct perception, you ended up saying the Buddhist mind is purely valid direct perception. You didn't specify mental. So the question is, it sounded like you're saying that the Buddhist mind is just mental direct perception. That's, I believe Buddhism does have sensory perception as well.
So can I put the question like this then? Does the Buddhist mind, whilst the Buddhist mind the minds of a Buddha are all direct perceivers, are they solely mental direct perceivers or also sense direct perceivers? Yes. So as you said, the Buddhist, whilst the consciousnesses of a Buddha are all direct perceivers, they are both sense direct perceivers and mental direct perceivers. So as you said.
Okay.
Oh, yes.
I'm having a bit of a struggle. On one hand, we're saying that the self appears completely ordinary sometimes the body's in pain, sometimes the body's not in pain, sometimes we think it's practical, something like that. So we know we're not impermanent, because we're mixing with the aggregates, which are constantly changing. But at the same time, we're saying that the innate view is holding the self to be independent and unchanging. So how do we reconcile what appears to be a contradiction?
It seems like we have a contradiction in the way that we relate to the self, where on one hand it appears that the self is unchanging, because we can talk about the self younger to now, and we relate to it as being the same self, so unchanging. But on the other hand, the self appears also to be integrated with the physical mental aggregates, and we know these are impermanent. We know our body has changed, we know our mind has changed. So that seems on the one hand our sense of self is impermanent, but it's also on the other hand permanent. So how can we overcome this dichotomy?
다디 미다바레 따바마레 이내가서 로라 나도 따바 규고 규님에만 따바 능고래 제자디 나와레스 짐비로데 로록셰 차고르와 제장아도 디 제바 제제 다들바 제바치 미다바 님바디 아주 제바치 미다바 이바 오디 아주 오쳐고 미다바 또고 제자 디레 양아주 풍보디래야 아주 풍보 라바라바디 유어저 투고 뭐 풍보 참아den가서 유어저 봐 그거 뭐 진짜 풍보난 다 이제는 다디 안줄을 차와리 풍보den가서 왕식이 유두기 통통해 진짜 라관장 먼저 제 라바라바디 유어저 같은가서 하고 두고 봐 진짜 참모디 안 하고 두고 진짜 지바를 그 다디가서 나요도 나와는 딱바 능고를 있는 거 딱바 말고 미다바래 돼요 진짜 당하는 지 미다바 이미 김제 삼다 야나에 제바체는 아니 미다바 뭐 쳐봐 하고 봐 있나 아니 그 미다바 레스를 딱바디 도고로 와 다 세리 다디 뭐 미다바래 이내 그 나야라 딱바는 거래.
That's really an excellent question. So continue to contemplate on that, meditate on that, and come to differentiate exactly how our sense of self spontaneously arises to us. Because there we will see that it does arise as being unchanging, as being permanent. And whilst when we looking and we thinking, we're analyzing, we will recognize that our body and mind are impermanent, and that therefore our self must be impermanent. But this is when we are actually trying to see how the self appears and analyze and investigate, as opposed to how it spontaneously arises. Because the self, in its essence, is impermanent. But the way it naturally arises to our mind, or it spontaneously arises to our mind, is as unchanging. So the process you're on is the correct process. And as you continue that, then this will become ever clearer.
That 그 삼단의 디차에서 대장 중에 다도 나도 직다과도 스나게 다과에서 치료비게 다과에서 킬링 거래 마동안 중에 낭비게 다과에 킬링 거가 낭비 미다과래라 다 미다과래라고 규어 두고래서 그래 맞아 나야라 규어 다과는 거리네 뭐를 규어 두고래서 그래 세상 안 중에 낭비게 다디 미다과래서 그래 풍보다 다 차상 미다과래라고 대시 치료비게 제바치라지도 다 다과래 풍보다 샘디게 미다과래서 해야지
So what may well be happening here is that on one hand we've heard before the presentation of other religions that the self is permanent. But we've also on the other hand heard that the Buddhist view is that the self is impermanent. So therefore intellectually we know that we are looking for as an impermanent self. So we know this intellectually, but only intellectually at this point.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.